Shanghai. Nien Chang was an Anglophile. She spoke fluent English. She liked red wine. She listened to European classical music. She had toast for breakfast with butter and jam. She was a cosmopolitan, and she was a nationalist activist.
It's interesting that communism does take off in a significant way in China, in a way it doesn't quite in India during this period. It's a sort of different sort of nationalist tradition. There is, of course, a long-standing and important Communist Party of India, both then and now, but it wasn't dominant in the way that, of course, it came to be in China. And the Second World War also provides a real turning point in China. Again, different experience from India. India very much involved in the Second World War, not least sending thousands and thousands of troops as part of the empire effort, but also, of course, through Subhas Chandra Bose, a presence through the Indian National Army on the Japanese side. But China itself, of course, was a battlefield in the way that India wasn't. And that, of course, essentially devastates the country. It also provides circumstances in which eventually the communists, by then led by a man named Mao Zedong, became famous to the world as Chairman Mao, conquers China. And that happens in 1949. There's a civil war in which Mao takes over China. He announces from the Gate of Heavenly Peace, the front of the Forbidden City in Beijing, that, well, he doesn't say it there, but he says elsewhere that the Chinese people have stood up in front of the Gate of Heavenly Peace. He just announces that the PRC, People's Republic of China, has been founded. So that takes us on into the sort of culmination point almost. These efforts to try and get rid of the foreign presence in China have succeeded. There are very few foreigners in China when Mao's in power during the time of communism. But even that doesn't seem to be enough to stem or end this really sort of strong fixation that China's communist leaders in particular have about throwing out not just foreigners, but foreign influence. And I think that culminates, couple of decades later in the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s. And again, many people might know a bit about this sort of almost internal civil war where Chairman Mao set the Communist Party against itself. And, young teenagers were dressed up as so-called Red Guards in military uniforms, bullying and attacking their teachers and experts in the system to sort of force them to confess their revolutionary sins. And the reason I bring this up is the experience of one person you write about in the book, a woman named Nien Chang, is a very good example of what happened to at least some Chinese who had stayed in China after the Communist Revolution, very much working with the system. But because of their foreign connections, because of connections, in fact, to the British, found themselves at the end of a very, very painful set of experiences. Could you tell us a bit about Nien Chang and what her experience tells us more broadly about this period once the communists had taken over?
Sure. Yes, indeed. And I'm glad you mentioned Nien Chang. It's a fascinating story. Nien Chang studied in this country, in Britain, at the London School of Economics, and arrived, I think it was in 1936, was very involved in efforts amongst Chinese students and others in this country after the Japanese invasion entered its fullest phase in mid-1937 to raise awareness of this hideous conflict that was unfolding on the other side of the world, to try and persuade the British to act, to intervene, or British consumers to boycott Japanese goods, and so on. And Nien Chang was at the heart of this sort of activity in this country. She stomped around Britain. She came to Bristol. In fact, she came to my university and spoke at a meeting here. She would go anywhere. She went to county fairs where and crowned the May Queen and one in Wiltshire to try and get the message across to British audiences. She married a fellow student who became a member of the nationalist government's foreign service. They spent part of the war years, the rest of the war years, in Australia. And in fact, her daughter was the first Chinese child born in Australia's Capital Territory. and returned to China at the end of the war, and he secured a job in the foreign sort of affairs department in Shanghai. Nien Chang was an Anglophile. She spoke fluent English. She liked red wine. She listened to European classical music. She had toast for breakfast with butter and jam. She was a cosmopolitan, and she was a nationalist activist. She was asked to take a role as a liaison between the British company Shell and the Chinese interests, which were working to take over its assets in China after the coming to power of the Chinese Communist Party. She had all the skills. She socialized with the British in her circle of friends still remaining in Shanghai. She served the revolution and the new state's nationalistic agenda by helping dismantle this foreign company. She had served China's interest more widely in raising international sort of awareness of the assault on China. But in 1966, her home was attacked by Red Guards. She was a classic target for this iconoclastic, xenophobic.
If you've enjoyed the conversation that you just heard, do subscribe to our channel for much more.